It's a particular pleasure to welcome Brendan Stone today. His work in narratives and in mental health is extremely well known locally and nationally, and he's founded some really great traditions in the use of narrative to both understand and support mental health in general, and I'm absolutely certain that it will be a great talk very shortly. I will just point out, as I always try to do, the upcoming ones, which we now have a nice little break for Christmas, which, can you believe, is just around the corner. The lights roll out on the children's hospitals, so I think we must accept that it is happening. And we kick off in February with Professor Jonathan Montgomery, who is Chair of the Nuffield Council of Bioethics, coming up from London to talk to us about healthcare and law. And judging by the conversation I had with him over dinner one evening, I think that will be extremely stimulating and very exciting. But with no further ado, with huge pleasure, it is a great privilege to hand over to Brendan. Thank you very much.
We must have dinner and have an interesting chat sometime. Mind you have just asked me to come to the pub with you, so not tonight. Anyway, thank you ever so much. It's lovely to be here. And, well, I'm going to do what it says on the tin. I'm going to talk about particularly journal writing in the context of mental illness, or as I prefer to call it, mental distress. And the lecture tonight is intended to build on work that I've been doing over the last few years and take it in a slightly new direction. I had to write my research plans for my head of department the other week, so I actually managed to crystallise them, and if things go well, this is me trying something out really, actually, so if it goes disastrously I may change the plans, but we shall see. So what I'm going to talk about is kind of summed up on the screen really. I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail about that, but what I'm really interested in is what does an examination of a distressed self and its autobiographical work tell us about how mental distress is experienced. I'm really interested in the relationship between mental distress and narrative and language, and the role of the other person, in the negotiation with and the representation of severe mental distress. So I'm particularly interested in learning about and describing what we might call the phenomenology of distress. And it seems to me that journals may be a useful means to understand this. In terms of the kind of methodology, I suppose, or the theoretical influences on what I'm about to say, some names are on the screen. I'm sure some will probably be more familiar than others, but broadly speaking, these are theorists of trauma, scholars who are informed by varieties of psychoanalysis, particularly attachment theory, strains of thought, researchers in psychology, neuroscience and psychiatry, the great narrative theorist Paul Ricoeur, and some writers from the tradition of continental philosophy and ethics like Blanchot, Levinas and Kaufmann. So it's really interesting to be here tonight following Javi Carrel, who spoke here last week, and I don't know if any of you were here, but it was a wonderful lecture, and I would really recommend Javi's book, Illness, The Cry of the Flesh. And Javi was talking about how we might live well with illness, how illness can actually be edifying, as she called it, or life-affirming. And she described how illness might be a forceful invitation to philosophize, and talked about what illness might be able to give to philosophy. And I'm going to kind of address some of the same themes. For me, what makes Javi's book stand out is that woven throughout the text, which is philosophically highly literate — I'm not a philosopher, but it seems to me it's highly literate, beautifully informed text. But what's woven throughout it are reflections by Javi on her own experience of living with serious illness. So what results is this kind of beautifully negotiated movement between phenomenology and autoethnography, or autobiography if you like, in which the self and the self's experience become the objects of inquiry and research. And I want to think tonight a little bit about that action of the self looking at itself in tough times and making representations, reflecting, considering and learning by looking at itself. And whether we call this autoethnography, memoir or autobiography, I think an uncanny dynamic structures this activity, which even in the simplest account involves the present self, recalling, interpreting and representing the action of a past version of the same self. So, a view of human identity as narrative in nature, the idea that we are creatures who need and have a fundamental relationship to narrative, has been developed by many scholars from diverse disciplines. And for myself, I would call myself a narrative skeptic. I think narrative is important, but as I haven't got time to talk about it tonight, but the great philosopher Galen Strawson wrote a famous article now which suggested that not all human beings actually experience the world through narrative, but actually some of us, and actually I would count myself as one of these, experience the world in episodic or more fragmented ways. But nevertheless, and notwithstanding that skepticism, I would want to claim, and will claim, possibly not tonight, but I will at some stage in the future, that actually there is something fundamentally narrative about human existence, whether or not we experience the world, material reality, in a narrative way or not. So, in thinking about distress and narrative, I have found it productive to draw on theories of attachment and child development in order to understand some, but certainly not all, forms of human distress. So, my assumptions are that human beings exist within, and need to exist within, narrative understandings which enable us to make sense of the world and ourselves. These narrative understandings exist at different levels. Some are profound and life-shaping, fundamental really, to the very nature of our being. Others are contingent and change. And these different levels, the profound and the contingent, may intersect and perhaps inform each other. I'm going to tell you about profound narrative in a moment, but a more contingent narrative might be I suppose proponents of religion would say that a religious narrative was fundamental, but I would say a religious narrative about life is actually contingent, because of course people can move away from religions, might take up a different understanding, a more political or socio-cultural narrative with which to understand their lives. Anyway, I'm not going to go into that cul-de-sac. The narratives we inhabit, I would claim, must be adequate to contain and make sense of our experience, or they must be a good fit. We must feel comfortable within the narrative that we inhabit. It's worth noting that we are not the sole authors of the story we inhabit. Others' narrations of us and socio-cultural narratives also define us to a greater or lesser degree, and these may sometimes be toxic or constraining. And certainly people living with serious mental illness have grounds, I think, to suggest that socio-cultural narratives around certain forms of mental illness are still, unfortunately, often quite toxic productions. However, if you want to re-author the self, to tell a different story, create a different narrative which fits you more comfortably, this is not necessarily straightforward, especially if your inner psychological resources are depleted and you're surrounded by these kind of forceful, toxic external narratives. The most important requirement for good mental health, this is a big claim I'm about to make, isn't it? I can't believe I just said that, sorry. One might hypothesize that a very important component to good mental health is to be secure in a story in which the self exists, matters, is recognised and valued by others, and can recognise and value others. This story is important because it forms what John Bowlby called a secure base for psychological development and personal resilience. But if it does exist within us, if we are fortunate enough to reside within this narrative framework, to be secure on this base, it will be so taken for granted that often we will be barely aware of it. This, what I'm calling a story, is formed through early interactions with caregivers, and it enables the self to deal with its feelings, recognise its own identity, and achieve a secure sense of being. So a key dynamic in the successful construction of the self is empathic and compassionate recognition by another, by a caregiver, as an independent being. And through this process of being recognised, the infant gradually learns to assign words and meanings to its experience, and from this gradually enters into what we call culture. It forms an inner private space in which it can comfort and recognise itself, and in which self-talk, that inner monologue, can form. And that self-talk, I would want to suggest, is an analogue of its early speech with its caregiver. It's a version of that speech which began in its words to a parent or a caregiver. All of this is the secure base. Now, if this recognition doesn't happen or is attenuated in some way, this fundamental and secure base will not be properly formed, and the self then does not perhaps come into secure being and struggles to assign meaning to its experience. Its feelings may appear strange and overwhelming, lacking meaning, and unconnected to its immediate experiences. And the outcomes throughout life may be expressed through manifold forms of mental distress. Now, the self, the adult self who finds itself, I'm calling it, but anyway, I will do for now. I hope you know what I mean, he or she. The self that experiences distress as an adult may, perhaps will need to find a narrative to inhabit which enables him or her to make sense of experience. And the narrative which people living with mental distress may turn to could be a medical biological narrative which explains the manifestations of distress through diagnoses, through a medical model of understanding mental illness. It could be psychosocial, social, political, religious, or indeed combinations of these, and there's probably lots I've missed out. If the distressed self has experienced early trauma in an abusive, neglectful, or unsupportive environment, unprocessed feelings may circulate within the adult self in a kind of feedback loop, with the self finding it difficult to assign them meanings or weave them into the narrative fabric of identity. The form in which these traumatic feelings are expressed may appear terrifying, alienating, and overwhelming, so that the inner world is not at all a refuge, but rather a location to be fled from, avoided, or pacified through self-harm, self-medications, or by other means. Now, as I say, I don't want to say this is the model for all types of distress or mental illness. What I've been describing, I think, could broadly be called developmental trauma disorder or complex post-traumatic stress disorder. But I don't know if any of you are aware, the British Psychological Society released a report last week which has caused a lot of controversy on Twitter, which was about understanding schizophrenia and psychosis. And actually, I think those diagnoses, there are problems with the BPS report, but broadly I think it says some interesting things. But basically those diagnoses, for them anyway, sometimes spring from, I would say, things like developmental trauma disorder as described by Van der Kolk here. Early patterns of attachment enable the quality of information processing to begin. Secure infants learn to trust, understand the world. They can rely on their emotions and thoughts. They have confidence, and they learn a vocabulary to describe their emotions and communicate them. Susan Harter, in a chapter has been really influential on me in her table titled Deleterious Effects of Child Abuse on the Self System. Just look at the top 4 there, because these are pertinent to my theme tonight. She describes reduced self-awareness, an impaired sense of agency, disruptions in the sense of self-continuity, the sense that one is the same person over time, and a lack of a sense of self-coherence. You can see, I think, in Harter's description there, the challenge to the narrative self, which has to, if it is to be coherent, proceed on the basis of self-coherence, self-continuity, and the like. So, I want to look at a few journal extracts now and see whether we can learn anything about the relationship between narrative, the self, and distress. In the past, I've looked at quite a few journal articles that have been published, but the diaries I want to share with you now have not been published. And the first extracts I want to look at were written in the late 1970s and record the writer's first hospitalisation in a psychiatric facility following a major breakdown. But before showing you some of these unpublished extracts, it's important for me to note an important factor. These writings are mine. And date from my late teenage years. I think it's fairly well known that I have lived with mental health problems and still do to some extent. And I hope to be able to justify why I'm doing this. In work which will follow this, in the book that I told my head of department I'm going to write, so watch this space, I'll draw together this auto-ethnographic impulse with looking at other unpublished journals and some published journals. But today, in an experiment, I'm going to be looking at my own, so bear with me and be kind. So anyway, just to give you the backstory, at the age of 19, after several years of experiencing increasingly severe mental distress, I was admitted to a psychiatric hospital, and this was to be the first of several admissions. So, as you think about the presentation of the self and the journals I'm going to show you, you obviously need to take into account the fact that it is the writer who's presenting them to you, albeit with several decades. I know it's hard to believe, but there are several decades between me now and me at 19. And obviously I bring to my interpretations of the writings, which are my own, contextual information which may not be present in the texts themselves, and actually that can be very useful, but equally it can be obfuscatory, it can obscure. And of course, in addition, we will find ourselves shortly in a strange hall of mirrors, in which a version of a self looks back at its own articulations from many decades ago, which are themselves images of the same self, supposedly, regarding and interpreting itself. So this presentation itself could be seen as a kind of auto-ethnographic practice then, performed or enacted live in front of you. And the context of its presentation within the university I work in front of people, some of whom I know, must also be taken into account. It's only very recently that I've returned to these pages, which for the past decades have largely been stored in a box. I opened that box 10 years ago, but didn't really look at it. And now that I do look, I am quite surprised actually by what I find, and at the same time intrigued. So the pages you're about to see were written on my first full day at the age of 19 in this large asylum, as they were then. I'd been admitted the previous day following a major breakdown. The only other thing to say before I show you this is, please remember this was the late 1970s. Some of the language would now be called politically incorrect. It wasn't then, actually, and for that I apologise. So these are the first things I wrote. And the first thing that really struck me about this when I opened the box was the orderliness of the writing before I even read it. Just glancing at these pages, you can see the order. The text is laid out in paragraphs and sentences. The handwriting is quite neat. And when one begins to read, a clear and quite lucid style emerges. So let's have a quick look at some of the content. This is the way it starts. Got up about 7, didn't sleep very well, the room was hot and stuffy, and I had a headache from smoking too much. The night nurses sat nearly outside my door, one a great big fat woman who seemed pretty cheerful, and the other a youngish bearded guy, a bit laconic. The main problem here seems to be what to do with the day. 7 till 8, had a couple of cups of tea and wandered around in my pyjamas, talked with a guy called John, who's here to be dried out. Don't know if he's an alkie or not. I don't think that was probably very respectful even then, so I apologise. I was 19, remember. Tried running on the spot in my room, but got knackered really quite quick. 8 was breakfast, cornflakes, etc., etc., etc. Then down the bottom of that page, the hospital is set back quite away from the main road, presumably to keep patients from straying too easily. It's set in low-lying countryside, fields of what appear to be rough pasture stretch away until the December mist turns everything into a bleak blur, etc. Okay, and then it goes on. Okay, so that orderly and really quite lucid style surprises me, I think, because of the context of this writing. In the weeks and months leading up to this admission, I'd really been extremely unwell, extremely overwrought, severely distressed, and my thinking in those months had been a long way from being lucid. It also surprises me because in this collection of journals I have from this period, and I've got a lot, many are far from orderly or coherent. I'll show you just a brief glimpse of one of those much less coherent pages later. The way the journal starts is also really interesting. Remember, these are the words of a 19-year-old beginning his first day in a mental hospital. He'd never been in one before. And yet the diary starts with a simple account of how he'd slept, as if this was just another day. Most of the text in the opening pages of the journal, in fact in the entirety of the journal actually, focuses on describing the environment of the hospital, the patients, the staff, the routines. There's very, very little, certainly in these opening pages here, about how I actually am. Only a couple of passages refer or allude to my inner world, which only on the preceding days had been chaotic, frightening and overwhelming. And even here, it's marginal, really, allusion. Maybe on the second page, halfway down, everything seems a bit drab and bleak this morning. Not surprising, I guess. I don't feel too bad, just a bit empty and drained. So, minor allusions. If we look at the following pages, we can see a more introspective passage. Again, you note the orderliness of the style. In terms of content, however, there is a clear and considered movement towards introspection. The pages begin with a reflection on a fellow patient called John, and then move to me. And that transition from a concentration on another person to imagining my own future is interesting, I think, and that will become clear as I get towards the end of the presentation. So I start off, second paragraph down, wondering about this guy called John. I wonder what he'll do on the outside. I heard him say that he could always chuck a brick through a window and get back in if he wanted to. He'll probably be living in some grotty hostel or bedsit on the dole with no real prospect of a job and little incentive to get one. I seem to be a very judgmental young man, I apologise for that. Funny, that idea almost sounds attractive to me now. I quite like to be alone in a strange town, or say a big town like London, and then I imagine living on my own in a big town like London. And then at the bottom of that page, I don't know, I think I need to live alone, really alone, to find out who I am, etc. And then you can't rely on others to run your life. Maybe I was doing too much, albeit subconsciously, until I couldn't even get it together to make decisions like whether to make a cup of tea or not, whether to have a fag before I went to bed or in bed, whether I really wanted a fag, whether I was really tired, finding it impossible to do anything or concentrate even on making my bed, watching television like a zombie, the only pleasure or peace gained at night when everyone was asleep and I was too tired to bother anymore, just sitting in front of the fire. All this stuff is about me, too much thinking about me, too. The day's brightening up now, it's 9:30, there's a group of farmhouses. I think this is a really interesting passage. That's not the same thing as saying I was a really interesting young man, but intellectually this is interesting, I think. One thing that's really interesting is that reflection on the outside, on the person of my fellow patient called John, is this catalyst for imagining. And while the reflections peter out, I think what happens here is something important. The writer, the young me, is imagining a different future, albeit one that doesn't sound particularly attractive. But for the writer, this is patently of meaning, or is a way by which he tries to make meaning. He is trying on a possible future in the form of a different kind of story and seeing whether it fits him. And from there, of course, he revisits, I'm talking about me in the third person now, this will get confusing, but anyway, hopefully you follow me. He revisits the recent painful past of distress before backing off quite abruptly and returning to that focus on the outside world with this focus on farmhouses. And there's a suggestion, I think, that remembering process, that revisiting of recent distress is difficult in the quite abrupt way it's broken off. And you can see this dynamic happening elsewhere in the journal, and some passages seem to shed light on what actually, psychologically, is happening here. So this is a few pages on, and I'm remembering an ex-girlfriend of mine called Elaine. I remember Elaine used to have it on an LP. She always had good taste, bless her. I guess they were better days. There's a way you could get to revel in this sort of life, nothing to do but wait for the next meal, or you could really get into it, but that's more difficult. Outside there's the real world. Hopefully I'll be back there soon, living a bit better maybe. What is there? Life, living. Remember those great big Kerouac novels, crammed with the exuberance, sheer ecstasy of living, being alive. But here there's no incentive to do anything, oh God, but keep it quiet, look around you, there is more, there is more. And then down the bottom, and so 10:30 and the day is done, remember, try and get into what you're doing maybe, write about things outside yourself, descriptions of places you've been to, try and enjoy yourself, look around, life is there in you, there is hope. Here we see, I think, in that exhortation to look around, a key to what is happening, which maybe sheds light on the preoccupations of the journal. This concentration on and description of a world outside the self is viewed by the writer as a resource for self-help. And it enables him to achieve some distance or safety from the enervating power of distress. A very similar thing happens on this page, where I'm talking about another patient and then reflecting on my own self. I'm talking about this lady, and in the brackets there I go, her face is sagged and dropping, folds, her mouth turned down dourly at the corners, breaking into a toothless vent when she smiles, and she still does. But her restlessness is surely no different to your own nervousness. Maybe she seems odd because she's old and different to you. Her pacing and continual up-down nervous movement seems sad and lonely because she strikes you as an old and therefore sad and lonely person. But how much more sad and lonely than you? Note the way in which introspection, self-observation are prompted again by engaging with and reflecting upon one of my fellow patients. Note too the way the narrative shifts into the second person here. This is a highly unusual narrative device, actually, of narrative writing, but it doesn't, in my view, signify any kind of pathology, but rather as a way of negotiating the multiple identities within narrative identity. Yeah, you can see the sorts of things that were happening in the hospital in this passage. This is, I won't read it all, but this is an account, a narrative account of when I got very, very distressed and was forcibly restrained within the hospital and tranquilized. It describes thinking I was going to suffocate and being very, very distressed. I do remember this episode quite well, actually, although there were several episodes like this. But At the very far right, at the bottom, in the evening, I broke down into tears on a few occasions. I felt lonely and desperate. I thought of leaving the hospital, etc. But it's interesting to me to see that this account remains orderly and lucid in describing an episode which I remember at the time as being very difficult and highly disorienting. And I waited until I was able to narrate it. Okay, so you'll note in all these extracts in which I address the fact of living with distress, it's done in a rational, quite considered way. So what's happening here? In order to understand this, I think a little bit of contextualization is needed. We might point to the specific environment of the hospital as being influential in the kind of discourse that's produced here. Perhaps the relative calm of this old-style asylum quietened me down. Well, this might be the case, but it's worth pointing to some later journals when I wasn't in hospital and not on medication. Shortly after this, following a period where I'd been admitted several times, I left the UK actually running away from this asylum to go and live in Belgium with some other young people. And this was a very different environment to the hospital. Here I was very exposed, without clinical care, without medication. There was no routine. I was still experiencing severe distress, and I had to try and find money to live on. This is the first pages of the journals in Belgium. And again, I note, in a very different context, the orderliness of the narrative. The first section, the first thing I write is observational, it's quite poetic. Speeding through afternoon countryside, giant bridges approach us against girders of riveted steel, wide grey canals and barges with loads of fruit sail to Holland, etc. I then move on into a narrative section, which includes reflection on my internal state, but we again come up against this theme, that urge to focus on the world outside. So, down near the bottom of the first page, I went out, it was about 10 p.m, I hadn't planned to go far, just wandered slowly around the flyovers and motorway entrances. I noticed one or two things for a change instead of thinking and worrying all the time as I usually do. Maybe this was because I was planning on going straight to bed when I got in, so I knew what was in front of me and wasn't worrying about what was going to happen. So again, we see that urge to focus on the world. This is after I'd been in Belgium for 2 weeks, and here we see reflection again on distress. This is third paragraph down, I think it is, first side. I started writing, and when I stopped I was feeling weird again and had to sit down and try not to think. We ate and I tried to read but failed miserably, unable to concentrate. I managed to close my eyes in a comfy chair and begin to feel a bit better. Note that trying not to think. I think when we combine these various insights and themes with some other sources from elsewhere, we can begin to get a picture of what's happening in these journals. And moreover, I think this is useful, and it gives us insight into recovery and psychological processes. I think we can view the journals as an attempt to construct an inner world. The journals as predicated on a desire to order and record a life which had become extremely chaotic and difficult and continued to be. And this ordering, of course, is detailed and strongly narrative in its nature. The journals are an attempt to construct an inner world and an inner voice, which is a space of refuge and ordered reflection. In addition, textual analysis reveals active attempts to intervene and construct a way of being in which it is possible to survive. The journals are actively being used as a tool to change and reconstruct the self. And I'm reminded here of others who've used journals and writing as a means to order a world turned upside down by distress. Bonnie Shell, for instance, writes that forcing herself to read and write was the only order she could feel in the universe. Typing sentences and editing was my way back to recovery. Linda Hart says, writing this journal has kept me on the edge of sanity. Without it, I believe I would have tipped over into the chasm of madness from where I could not be reached. Lara Jefferson, I kept writing in an effort to escape. I have sat through floods of raving and built a barrier, a breakwater of small black words around me. Carol North, my thoughts sometimes got so hopelessly jumbled that I needed to write them down for my own comprehension. Not all of these texts are the same. They do tell different stories, and I think different insights pertain, but there is a common engagement with a process of writing. The attenuation of the sense of self in distress, that disruption to a settled sense of an I, of a single person, and that concomitant disruption to the ability of the self to maintain a coherent inner voice, which is felt to be under one's own control, is also a ubiquitous theme in writing about mental illness, from psychiatrists to patients to psychologists and the like. Moreover, a great deal of opinion and academic work from diverse areas suggests that strengthening the sense of self is an aid to recovering a life. For some journal writers, therefore, I think writing is a means by which they attempt to actively reform a shattered sense of selfhood. The psychological mechanisms by which this is attempted merit further discussion, which I don't have time for, but a key aspect of this is a recovery of an inner voice of some kind, which one feels a degree of agency over, which one can control. And work from psychology and neuroscience over the last 15 years or so suggests that practicing self-talk, that inner monologue, may be an important factor for recovery from some individuals. Some later extracts from a journal written in the midst of distress speak of a predominant theme and speak to what I've just been describing. I'll only look very briefly at these because they're quite hard to read and difficult to read. There's a lot of this sort of stuff. But on the right, at the bottom, must write to be me, can write, can be me. And at the top, I drink Coke, smoke, and begin the talk at last. At last I start to talk again. I let the words flow. I take a book of poems to make me talk. What emerges then in those extracts is a sense that the ability to talk, to write, to signify, to make meaning is critical. And this is clearly linked to identity, to a sense of personhood or being. What we see in the journals is, I think, an attempt to reconstruct a coherent identity through a form of self-talk. As Davidson and Strauss describe it in this, what I would say is a very, very important article, this is about rediscovering and reconstructing an enduring sense of the self as an active and responsible agent. Moreover, this process is narrative in form. Narrative, by means of which meanings, understandings and purpose are constructed and the self is oriented in place and time. What seems to be happening, I think, is a compensation for an attenuated process of individuation from early life. The primary focus of the narratives, and these are not just mine, but all of those writers I've connected you with, the primary focus is on the outside world. And I think this connects with the social nature of selfhood and the way in which the narrative basis of selfhood is dependent on others and on others' narratives. It's about the interconnected nature of being a person. You'll note, however, in the journal articles by me that I've shown you, there is an avoidance of any in-depth exploration of distress or the reasons for it, which seems to be viewed by me, the younger me, as an unsafe ground to explore. And we see in later journals, I've just shown you a couple of pages very briefly, that this is indeed the case, that this is unsafe ground. And this in turn suggests that this kind of discourse might need to be conducted with a guide on hand, a therapist perhaps, which I'm sad to say in the late 1970s weren't, in my experience anyway, readily available in the NHS. So, thank you.
I hardly know where to start, having heard such a moving and personal narrative, and I applaud you for being prepared to share it in that way. I think that was extraordinary.
Well, I hope it was done appropriately and didn't feel self-indulgent.
It was not. It was perfect.
Well, thank you.
Would anybody like to start with questions or comments? It's such a strong and personal reflection, it's hard to know where to start, but I found it very interesting that a lot of these were things that you were not maybe saying out loud. So was there a big separation between the language that you wrote and the things that you were able to say? And was there a safety barrier in things that you could write? You maybe alluded to that, but the things you didn't write, in fact.
Well, I mean, it's very interesting, and I think I think your view on that is as valid as mine, really, because I mean, reading the journals, it does show me how fallible memory is. But my memory of those years is that they were characterised by overwhelming fear. That was the predominant emotion, and I don't think that really comes through. And I think what I was trying to do was stave off that fear. I was trying to construct a framework which would enable me not to feel afraid anymore. And certainly writers like Linda Hart and Lara Jefferson, I think, are doing very, very similar things. So I don't know if that answers your question.
So rather than using a journal to explore your feelings, they were actually creating a safe space.
Yes.
So you had one place in your day that was safe.
I think journals, I mean, obviously journals can be a safe space to explore our feelings, and now I do find them a safe space, but they weren't then, not at that moment, and that was my closing, slightly barbed and irritable comment about the lack of therapists. I mean, I do describe talking to psychiatrists, but there was minimal. I mean, actually, to be honest, there's not as much therapy now as there should be, as we all know, but then there wasn't much at all.
Brendan, did you use the journals at the time? Did you go back over them? Can you remember rereading?
Yes, I did, and some passages do that. I did reread them. It's very interesting from journals a couple of years down the line when I'd kind of left the NHS completely. The way I reflect on the experience of the hospital, which was very, very different to how I actually describe it in the journals. Now, I don't necessarily think that makes it correct, that later interpretation, but the interpretation is different to the one there. Yes, I did. I did go back, and I think that was a kind of reinforcing, a positive reinforcing. I remember in the first hospitalisation, the journals were very, very important to me. I had them with me all the time, and it felt like an inner resource, some way of nourishing some part of me that wasn't functioning very well. So, yeah.
When you were in the hospital, were any of the staff aware that you were looking and if so, what was their attitude?
They were, and I was going to mention that because I didn't really have time to, but I'm glad you've asked me. They were aware. At one stage I remember it being thought of as an expression of some sort of pathology, that I was always writing all the time. Well, obviously writing is a form of mental illness, as we all know, but yes, and then I remember getting into a dialogue with one of them about actually showing them what I'd written. They wanted to see what I'd written. And I think, you know, if I do some more work on this, I'd want to look for signs of that, because I think a key element in journal writing, and particularly unpublished journals, and I've got access to a few people's journals now, thankfully, and I'm hoping to get some more, is that sometimes when journals are written, they're not expected to be read by anyone else but the writer. And when I started writing those, they weren't expected to be. I didn't expect anyone. And what I want to do when I have a bit more time is look to see if the way I write and what I write about changes in some way. Having said that, I don't think we can say that a journal, whether it's about mental illness or something else, in and of itself is a sort of unmediated kind of window on the truth of a person, because the I within the text is itself a textual construction, and I think we become our own audience. So I wouldn't say the embodied writing self and the text as depicted in a narrative are necessarily the same. Or, you know, I think there are differences and gaps between them. But it's a really, really interesting question.
A few hands going up. I'll start there.
Thank you, Brendan. That was really, I think, quite brave.
I felt really nervous about doing it tonight, actually, which I never normally. Last week I was talking to 90 social workers about child sexual exploitation. I was fine with that, but talking, which obviously is really serious, but doing this tonight I was really nervous about it. Because it's not the first time I've talked about my own experience, but I think it's doing it here in this university was hard, and I knew there'd be
Well, I just want to thank you and acknowledge that I realised that was a brave thing to do.
Well, thank you.
One of the things I'm going to ask you about, I'm really quite interested in the form of the journal. And I was interested at one point when you went into the second person, you said it's a way of handling sort of multiple identities, you know, that kind of fragmentation that everybody experiences at times. I wonder as well if it's a distancing effect, a protective layer where you put a distance between yourself and the pain. And leading on from that is that what's the difference then between journal keeping and sort of fiction or creative writing, where there's an even greater distance between, but you can still order the chaos. In fact, you've got more possibilities to order the chaos through creative writing where you don't own it. So I don't know, what is it about the journal then? I mean, what's the difference in a way between ordering the experience in journal writing and ordering an experience through fiction or poetry?
Well, I think that's a fascinating question. There's lots to say about that. I mean, the first thing I just thought of when you were asking the question was I was doing a presentation at this event in the School of Health recently. It was called Technotherapies, and it was about the way apps and web apps and God knows what can help mental health. And one of the therapies that was being presented was called avatar therapy, where I think what it is you kind of put your likeness onto an avatar on the screen and then act out encounters with a psychiatrist or someone else. So you're naturally at a distance from yourself. Yeah, the distancing effect I think is right, and I completely agree with you. I mean, I don't think when I was referring to multiple identities, I wasn't using that in a pathological sense. I think we all have multiple identities. We need to talk to ourselves. Sometimes that's probably heightened when we are very fearful or distressed, and we become a sort of parent talking to our own distress. In terms of fiction, I think that's a really interesting question. I mean, Paul Ricoeur, the philosopher that I mentioned, who's kind of, well worth reading on this. I mean, he contends that the narrative universes that we actually inhabit are made up from the stories around us, from our own interpretations of those stories, and he doesn't differentiate actually between fiction and non-fiction. So, in theory, I suppose, for Ricoeur, you could kind of construct a model for living through watching EastEnders or something, although I wonder what it would be like. But, and actually it's interesting in the journal because there are passages where and I think Lara Jefferson definitely does, we do fictionalise aspects of what's going on with us. We construct elaborate metaphors. They're actually quite well worked out, actually, kind of literary constructions, in order to imagine and play with possibility, I think. And this is all about, for me, it's about kind of trying on different stories to see if they fit, to see if they shift perception in some way. So, yeah, fiction is fascinating, really fascinating.
Did you... Yeah, so I'm going to put my narratological hat on here.
Oh, God.
Because, I feel that people are fundamentally narrative. I mean, even Samuel Johnson saying, 2 or 3 years ago, that we are constantly each man is constantly reviewing his past and looking to the future, creating representations of things they're going to do. And I see that you do that in your journals here. My caveat within that would be to say that unless there's something really pressing in the present, which is takes up so much of your attention, you haven't got mental space to review the past or project things you might be doing. So my question then would be, is the episodic experience, the less narrative experience, then necessarily a manifestation of distress.
Ah, well, that's fascinating. Every question is, do you notice I say every question is fascinating? But it is, because actually another thing that I put into the original script of the talk was a thing about moments. There's a book which I only discovered the other day, written by a psychologist in the States. Nobody seems to have heard of it. It's called something like Moments of Being. And it kind of plays on this idea of an episodic human nature. No, I don't think they are manifestations of distress at all. I actually think what they are, I think what's happening there is I'm trying to construct a framework from words which is comfortable for me to live in and plays to that part of me, which I assume other people in the room share, which is probably more comfortable remembering in images and impressions and snapshots and glimpses rather than elaborate worked out stories. However, one of the things that I find slightly perplexing and confusing really is the very strongly narratively ordered bulk of those texts. But those glimpses, I think, are fascinating to me. In fact, they're like the description of the countryside, or, you know, which just, and it's obvious in those moments, which are often quite brief and fragmentary, that there's a lot of meaning, a lot of effort and thought gone into the creation of those glimpses. They seem to be very important to me. So I think they're a key way that I mean now, that is how I would describe myself. I experience the world in images and rather than as big joined up stories.
We have some hands up over here, so blue and then person next to you from me.
I'm really interested I've been through some similar experiences to you, Brendan, and it actually reminded me, I'd almost forgotten about it, this need that I had, this urgency, this absolute necessity to write it down. And I did. And what I was writing down, what I was trying to do was actually capture what was really true. And then it seems like, looking back on it, it's a really strange thing to do. Why would you pick up a pen and try to write down what the truth is, rather than just knowing it in your head?
Yeah.
Why did I need to find a way of expressing it? You know, sort of maybe objective, make it objective, make it other than me or something like that.
Yes.
I wonder if that's a sort of aspect of, for me, that was a key aspect of the therapy. I never really got around to writing narratives as such, just kind of fragmentary things which seem to have some kind of connection to some past events.
Yeah, I think, I mean, for me, I like that thing what you said about working out what's true. I kind of get that. I think it's when the boundaries of what is true become very blurred, where, you know, when distress actually begins to alter your perceptions, you know, the world no longer makes sense and becomes quite frightening in ways that other people patently don't see it as. It's kind of obvious that need to make material what is true and unchanging might have a huge therapeutic and very kind of critical role.
Yeah, I'm going to try to turn this into a question. It's sort of related to your image comment just a moment ago, thinking about things in images. So I'm really interested in what you're saying in the extracts that you showed, but also in the aesthetics of the writing. So the appearance of your writing as a kind of visual record, how sort of in the later journals, the letters are kind of moving across the lines, and you've got the capitals and the kind of the different ways of expressing the distress, communicating through those. And I was thinking sort of about the visual language, and I don't know if you know Bobby Baker's diary drawings, and about just thinking about kind of images in these works. And I think I noticed one little doodle that you had on one of the pages, and I was just wondering about whether you're going to, or how you're going to approach examining the kind of the aesthetics of your writing and the sort of and if the doodles have any kind of sort of particular relevance for you, and how that's going to be a part of your imagined book or the book that you're working on.
Yeah, the book, it's not imagined, it will happen. It's not a delusion.
I'm in the same situation with the book project.
No, sorry, I'm pulling your leg. No, it's nicely picked up on that, because actually there are lots of doodles throughout the journals. And Bobby Baker, if anyone doesn't know Bobby Baker's diaries, you should really look at them. They're amazing diaries about her own hospitalisation. And there was a big exhibition of her work on at the Welcome, wasn't there? It's fantastic work. And unfortunately, my drawing skills aren't anything like hers, but I really like what you say about the aesthetics of it, and that's what struck me when I first got them out of the box. It was partly the materiality of it, and how hard I'd pressed on the paper, and whether I'd kept the line, the spacing between paragraphs and sections, these little fragments of glimpses, kind of where I create an image about the countryside outside the hospital, and those doodles. I mean, they came later, the doodles, really, the drawings, when I got out of this medical environment, and it was, and actually what happened really was that distress became far more extreme, and often I think words literally failed me. So I don't really know how to, I don't think I've got a language or a critical discourse available to me at the moment, because I haven't read enough, to be able to speak about that. But maybe that is something I should look at. Maybe if you know anything that I should look at, then you'll tell me. But yeah, I agree, it's an important thing.
Take one more question, chap, just there. Sorry, yes, you.
Me?
You, perfect.
Hi. Yeah, again, just thank you for sharing that. I suppose I've kind of two questions that are slightly linked. The word that struck me in your presentation near the end was fear. And psychologists kind of think of response to fear in sort of 4 Fs, very broadly, don't they? Kind of fight, flight, freeze and fluidity. And I suppose on the one hand I'm wondering how much were these journals a flight, how much were they trying to unstick the freeze, and how much did they ever address the threat? And kind of linked to that, I suppose, on the other side, thinking of the kind of 2-speed brain, is how much of this was actually trying to open up that creative, slower brain, if you know what I mean, in order to access something that's in the fast brain.
That's great. Actually, I didn't know there were 4 Fs.
Well, you're unlikely to
fluidity, I like that.
because nobody fluidity essentially is overtraining. So you know the guy that landed the plane on the Hudson Bay?
Yeah.
At that point of fear, because he was so trained, you go into a fluidity.
Ah.
So you follow what you're training. So that's why soldiers go and run at bullets and do various things that the rest of us would kind of run the other way, because that's why they overtrain. So that's the point.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are elements of all 4 of those kind of modalities of acting in the books. I think there is a real caution though about exploring the roots of distress, because it was so overwhelming, and I didn't, and I think intuitively I must have realised it wasn't actually safe to do it, and there wasn't the resource around to help me do it. In terms of fleeing from it, I don't think I really flee from it as such, but I remain cautious about it. I sort of edge around it. I'm not ready to get too close to it, but obviously I have to acknowledge it at times. I like that idea though, the 4 Fs as a framework mainly, to explore this. So
That's the title of your book.
Well, the 4 Fs. With some of the language in the journals, it'd be the 5 Fs.
It's on so many levels, doesn't it?
So I know there were many more hands, but I'm sure Brendan would be happy to answer further questions, but I think in the interest of timing I probably should draw things to a close. Between both Brendan and Javi's lecture, I've been very moved by 2 very personal stories of illness, giving us different perspectives. I will remember how words formed your place of safety, and that will stay with me a while, and I'll think on that a while, and I thank you for sharing that. I think that was profound and moving, and I'm very grateful.
Thank you.